I can assure you that I will have the least discretion of anyone posting anything online. As a journalist, doesn't come into my vocabulary. And I'm going to crack on because we've got lots of speakers, and our first speaker today is Rocky Scopelliti from Optus. He's in charge of, they call it Industry 4.0, which I'll let him explain, but I think you probably have an idea of where he's coming from. He's done some really interesting research over the years, and I've interviewed him a number of times over my career, so you're in for a treat. If you do have questions, I'll pop back up just as Rocky is finishing. Wave at me, cough, raise your hand. If you've got a question, we've got microphones, and so we try and make it as valuable for you as you can. If not, I'm a nosy journalist, so I'll always have questions. So please join me in welcoming Rocky from Optus.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul and Mohad, for having me as part of your conference. Just launch this video. So, welcome, and it's great to share with you the insights of a very significant study that I've had the privilege of leading and conducting within Optus, which involved approximately 343 executives from 285 organisations across Australia. And after 15 years of research on demographic change and digital technology, I've found this to be a very, very important piece of work. Not to say that the pieces of work that I did before in the past weren't important, but this is very significant because we are on the cusp of very significant change characterised by the fourth industrial revolution. And so we really need a point in time here in Australia to form a baseline of how ready we are for what's about to come. And so, what I'm going to take you through is the key findings of what we found in this research, and I'm going to really touch on three key areas. The first is when it comes to the issues and the challenges facing enterprise Australia today. What are they? What are the things that are troubling enterprise Australia? And of the 343 participants within the study, a very large sample of those were boards of directors, CEOs, CIOs, CMOs, heads of strategy, finance, and other C levels. And so it's quite interesting to see the diversity of issues that are actually confronting Australian enterprises. The second area that I'm going to touch on is the area of digital transformation, because we need a point in time. We need some sort of way of calibrating where we're at with our digital transformation. And then the second part of that same topic is then how ready are these digital transformations preparing enterprises to perform exponentially, and I'll explain why that's significant. And then lastly, what I've put down in the document and in the report is a blueprint for an architecture, a business architecture of what enterprises are going to need to look like in a world characterised by the fourth industrial revolution. Now, everything that I'm going to share with you is contained in a detailed report, so don't bother taking in copious amounts of notes. I'll show you the link to the report as we get into it. Okay, so let me begin by saying the research found that success in the fourth industrial revolution is going to be a level playing field in terms of two important insights. The first is when it came to looking at the organisation's size or the age of an organisation, what we found was that they were not predictors of success in the fourth industrial revolution. And we compared organisations of all different shapes and sizes, whether they were ASX listed organisations, private organisations from different sectors and the like. We found no correlation between these two. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive because in many respects we often sort of think that size actually does matter, or that the age of an organisation, that the younger organisations, you know, have an advantage over the older organisations. We didn't find that at all. But then that invites the question of, well, if those two things, if those two characteristics are not predictors of success in the fourth industrial revolution, what are? And I'll come to those in a moment. Now, what we did find, though, is that Australian businesses, just like their global counterparts, are in fact falling behind. And I'll explain to you where those areas are. When it came to looking at digital transformations, what we found was that those transformations are focused on transforming the traditional model. They're focused on transforming yesterday's model, not in fact creating the new models that they're going to need to compete in an exponential world. But what we did find was that Australian enterprises, unlike their global counterparts, are adopting new and advanced technologies and prioritising the way with which they think about their human capital more so than their global counterparts. Now, the only industry to the exception of this was financial services, where the number one priority in that sector is the adoption of new and advanced technologies, and we'll get into this in a moment. But we did find some blind spots. Australian enterprises, unlike the global counterparts, are underestimating the speed, scale and impact of the fourth industrial revolution. And that's a phenomena that is very acute to this industrial revolution compared to those before it. The other two key areas that we found as well were that Australian enterprises have deprioritised the pursuit of productivity and top-line growth compared to their global counterparts. And what we would say is that the pursuit of productivity is fundamental to a lot of the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. And again, I'll explain those in a couple of moments. And so a gap has emerged, and the gap, or this discord, is between where organisations are investing in compared to what they are anticipating is going to have the greatest impact on their businesses going forward. And Australian enterprises are more aware of this compared to their global counterparts. And so this is a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is that we are more aware of these compared to our global counterparts, and we can either do something with that or we can stand back and watch it happen to us. And that's the pivotal point and moment that we're at in terms of our stage of transformation. Okay, so now let's look at the potential for organisations to perform exponentially. Now, before I get into the data, I just want to explain what we mean by exponential and exponential forces. There are essentially four very, very important forces that have really shaped the world as enterprises live in at the moment. And I'll just go through some of these. When we think about information enablement, what that's enabled is the dematerialisation of products and services. And some examples of that are, firstly, the largest media player in the world doesn't own media. The largest transport company in the world doesn't own transport. The largest property provider in the world doesn't own property. And I'm referring to Airbnb, Facebook and Uber. And there's a new one that's just started in the US that's swept across the US over the summer called Swimpy. Has anyone heard of Swimpy? Well, Swimpy is where you can put your swimming pool up onto a Airbnb type platform and rent it out for the afternoon. How cool is that? And that's launching in Sydney this month. And so my wife and I are thinking about having a value-added service by providing our 3 kids for entertainment for the afternoon as well. This is very important because these models are creating what's referred to as a new economic physics, and I've been quite open and vocal about the fact that that the economics of how linear-based models have performed compared to these exponential type models, we need to think very differently about, and I'll come back to that in a moment. On the multi-sided platforms have enabled us to rethink the way economic value is created. In the past, we've always thought that economic value was a function of demand and supply, and it still is, but we've always thought of value chains as raw materials over here on the left and then finished products there on the right. And economic value is a function of the steps and the providers in that process. But what platforms like Amazon have now taught us is that economic value is not a function necessarily of a linear process. In fact, that participants within an ecosystem all have a role to create value in some way. Recently, I published a book, and I tortured myself as to whether I should go through a publisher or whether I should self-publish. And I had mentors on both sides of the debate, and I really wrestled with it because I found Amazon to be so attractive as a publisher, where I could put my content up on the KDL platform. I could have an editor in the UK review it. I could have a graphic artist in the US or somewhere in Hong Kong do the graphics. This was so exciting, but I ended up going with a publisher, and sometimes I have second thoughts about that. But this is what multi-sided platforms enable us to do, is to be able to distribute the way we think about the creation of economic value. Exponential technologies have also allowed us to unlock the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy has really given way to the gig economy. And this is very, very important for all enterprises, because the way with which we think about organising labour in a fourth industrial revolution world is going to be profoundly different to how we've done that before in the past. So these forces have given rise to what's referred to as exponential organisations. What are exponential organisations? The Singularity University in the US defines an exponential organisation as an organisation who systematically outcompetes its competitors or peers by multiples or factors of 10 or more. Now, these organisations adopt new organisational techniques or accelerating technologies to achieve what I referred to before as a new economic physics, where the marginal cost of acquisition or supply becomes virtually zero. So for Airbnb to add another property, for Uber to add another vehicle to its fleet, the marginal cost of that is virtually zero. The Singularity University has been studying these organisations for about 10 years. I've been studying them here in Australia for about 5. We now know the DNA of what makes up these exponential organisations, and this is the DNA. And so it was only right then when we asked the question of how have the digital transformations that Australian enterprises have been significantly investing in prepared them to perform exponentially. And so we used the methodology behind this DNA to really address that. And so the way I'm going to explain this is in terms of the overall results and then some of the themes. So suffice it to say that the transformations of Australian enterprises are falling well short of them to be able to perform exponentially. And I'll explain this in 3 key categories. Firstly, the way we think about transformations from a front of house perspective. This is all of the digital experiences that organisations are investing in. The second area is then all around the processes that organisations are investing in terms of their people, and then lastly the environments upon which these models are operating in for their organisations. Now, the way to think about the algorithm and the methodology is that it's not percentage based, it's an absolute score. So what we're looking for is a score between 55, which is the minimum, and 84, which is the maximum. Any organisation that falls within that range is deemed to be performing exponentially. So Australian organisations are falling well short of the minimum exponential mark. So what this is highlighting is the extent of work and effort that is still required in order to transform those models to perform exponentially. And we found this whether it was the front of house customer experience activities, whether it was the way with which they're managing labour and their employees, or the environments upon which organisations are operating within. Let's now unpack this in a little bit more detail. Okay, the common narrative within Australian organisations is we're customer centric. We'll put the customer at the centre and at the heart of everything that we do. Hands up those of you who would say your organisations do that. None? One, thank you. Well, this is a problem because the narrative, there is a disconnect between the narrative of organisations saying that they put the customer at the heart and the centre of everything they do versus what organisations' executives are reporting back to us. Now remember, these 343 executives self-assessed their organisations based off that DNA. And so this is a problem here. Because despite our narrative, we're not quite putting the customer at the heart and at the centre of everything that we do. And so executives reported back to us that the extent to which customers are influencing their organisation, the design of products and services, is well short of that narrative, with only 40% reporting back to us that the customers influence their organisation, products and services. Now, when it comes to then looking at employees, I would say the other concerning area is around innovation, because the narrative within Australian enterprises are that that we're either innovative or innovation is going to lead to our success. But our tolerance for when it fails is very, very low. And this was a point that Mo had mentioned at the start. There is a problem here in our culture towards innovation, because in other places around the world, failure is deemed the pathway to success, and it is incorporated within the way with which we embrace innovation. But here in Australia, 1 in 2 executives reported back to us that innovation failure is either a career limiting move or in name only in their organisations. And again, this is a disconnect with our narrative. We know that people are the core to innovation, yet the extent to which organisations are promoting and mandating the sharing of knowledge, collaboration and communication within their teams is still very, very low here, with only 1 in 5 organisations reporting that they do that across their organisations. And then lastly, when it comes to agility, this is the other third area. We often hear that organisations are pursuing agile, either as a methodology or as a culture or what have you. But what we would say is that what we found was that we're agile so long as we do it in-house. Now, this is a problem because exponential models don't work that way. They clearly understand what is core and what is not core, and what is not core, they'll push out to a best of breed external player, whether that's a business function or whether that's a technology. Now, I'm just going to pause here because in the spirit of the theme of this conference, automation is a big problem here in Australia. What was reported back to us was that only 14% of executives reported back that their organisations had processes that were self-provisioning and automated end to end. And you find that when you look at the P&L of many ASX listed companies, you see the ratio of labour in terms of the operating expense in their model, and you can see that we're still very, very labour intensive. And this creates and is interconnected back into the, it's very hard to present with the sound of the seagulls in the background. I feel like having a rest. This is locked into that issue that I mentioned before around productivity, the pursuit of productivity. We shouldn't be thinking about the pursuit of productivity as an expense of labour. We need to be thinking about this as a business outcome. And then the third area is then the state of our analytics capability, where organisations' quality of their data and their analytics capability is still quite low compared to other analytical competitors. And so this is what I referred to before, is that when we think about the world that enterprises now operate within, we are now operating in a completely new economic environment where our traditional linear view about growth and the way to compete has fundamentally changed, because where that exponential line crosses that linear line, that's your Kodak moment. That is where a linear model can no longer compete against an exponential model, because an exponential model can achieve the new economic physics where the marginal cost of acquisition or supply becomes virtually zero. And so the point that I want to get to here is you've got to be very thoughtful about the timing of your digital transformation and what you are transforming, because if you're transforming a linear model to just perform linearly, but just digitally linearly, it's not going to get you in a position to actually pursue this. And so what I've done in the report is then to sort of show Australian enterprises know full well what's going to impact their businesses over the coming years. These are the priorities. Now, unsurprisingly, these are all data-fueled technologies characterised by the fourth industrial revolution, and cyber and information security is the number one issue that Australian enterprise executives report is going to have the biggest impact. So let me now bring this together. Again, we can't think about the way we create economic value as a linear process anymore. It's in fact a multi-sided platform. In the world characterised by the fourth industrial revolution, you've got to think about your enterprises as directly or having connectivity by not just customers, employees and the environments, but you're going to have the Internet of Things, smart cities, autonomous vehicles. Your businesses are going to connect to sensors, objects, systems and networks like never before. And so at the heart of being able to perform in an exponential world needs to be thought of in terms of the cognitive intelligence based around the data and all of the technologies that surround that. This data will then inform the platforms, which will then give your models the scalability across different areas with which you operate, and the technologies, the new platforms, the Internet of Things, blockchain, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles. These are all the next generation of platforms that are emerging. These platforms will enable you to create applications that live dynamically, that are always on. These platforms then sit in networks which enable you to then think about your network as being the marketplace to which you can then sort of create capability and deploy it within your organisations. And what connects you to your ecosystem is APIs. So let me summarise. Okay, Australian enterprises, like their global counterparts, are focused on transforming their traditional model and making their traditional model perform linearly. We have some blind spots in terms of we're underestimating the speed, scale and impact of the fourth industrial revolution. This has created a discord in terms of where our investments and priorities are going versus what we anticipate is going to come at them. Australian enterprises are well aware of the technologies, the disruptive technologies that will impact them through the course of time. But we need to think about the forces that are changing the environment upon which we operate within. And these forces are really going to change our business architecture to be data-informed, platform-based, and capital-light models. So I hope that was insightful. Sorry, I've run a few minutes over, but happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rocky. And I can really advise you to look up the link that Rocky mentioned before. There's a very detailed report that Ops has put together, and the speed with which Rocky had to speak then shows that there was plenty to include. Is there any questions from the floor about Rocky and what he's had to speak? And if people are still feeling shy, I will just pose one question before we move on. Obviously, everyone here works within organisations, some larger than others. You work within Optus. When you recognise some of these issues about the exponential growth and the fact that an organisation is maybe not keeping pace, what can the individual enlightened executive actually do when they come back? Is there any action that you think people need to take when they go back to their businesses?
I'd bring it down to 3 key points. Firstly, Australian enterprises do have a cultural issue with innovation. And that's crystal clear. We have to reconcile our tolerance for risk, and importantly, we have to embrace failure as part of our learning pathway. And I don't think we're quite there yet. The second thing is we've got to create products and services that live dynamically. What we found was that products and services are being created in a one-way fashion. We create a product and service, push it out the door, and wait for the revenue to come in the door. Whereas if you think about this new world, products are being co-created with customers. They give you feedback, you incorporate that feedback. Facebook has a wonderful philosophy of yesterday's products just won't cut it today. How do we improve on it? Constant improvement. And then the third area, I think, is around the way with which we operate our organisations. Our models are still very labour intensive. We're not pursuing productivity as assertively as probably what we should be. So I would say innovation, think about living in a dynamic, real-time world, and productivity is not a dirty word.
Well, that's it certainly is in journalism circles. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Rocky Scopelliti from Optus.
Thank you.